Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. So just a little bit of housekeeping to start off with. So you've joined in listening mode only and your microphones have been muted and videos disabled. So if you'd like to ask questions or share thoughts throughout the session, please can you use the Q&A box to do so? It should be at the bottom of your screen, and we will work through any questions at the end of the session and follow up via email if we run out of time. You'll also be receiving a recording of the webinar after this session. So we'll start off with some introductions. I'm Amy Clark, I'm the category buyer here at YPO for our Managing Temporary and Permanent Recruitment Framework. So my role sits within our HR Services procurement team, and I manage all of our recruitment frameworks as well as our consultancy-based solutions and our occupational health framework. So I'm joined today by Richard Gilder from Matrix SCM, one of our providers on our framework for managing temporary and permanent recruitment. I will hand over to Richard for a brief introduction in a moment, but first we'll just look at our agenda and some content around the framework itself. So Richard will be leading on some discussions around the need for temporary workers in the housing sector, market updates and the transforming outlook of temporary worker managed service solutions. And the aim of this session really is to inform you of the innovation taking place in this market and to outline how the world is responding to market challenges and to advise as to what next steps you might wish to take. So a little bit about the framework to start us off. So the Managing Temporary and Permanent Recruitment Framework is available for use by all public sector organisations. The framework provides a compliant route to market for recruitment solutions and is broken down into 12 lots. So the relevant lot for today is lot 3, which is managing temporary recruitment for housing associations. And that provides a dedicated route to market for you. So it's important to note that the framework permits both direct award and further competitions, and that YPO offer free support to any contracting authorities looking to use the framework. The framework also permits the inclusion of what we call HR additional services, so that allows you to build call-off contracts that are bespoke to your requirements and capture associated services such as permanent recruitment or talent pool technology. So I'll hand over now to Richard for his introduction, but any queries about the framework, again, please use the Q&A function, or I'd be happy to have an offline chat as well.
Thank you, Amy, and well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks ever so much for joining us, and hopefully you can hear me okay. So, look, the very briefest introductions to Matrix SCM. Hopefully, as you can see from the slide here, we're a managed service provider for temporary and contingency workers, and I think we will be referring to sort of managed service provision. So I thought it was worthwhile just doing a quick sort of definition at this early stage. And the one that I use is that a managed service provider manages every aspect of temporary worker recruitment or management for an organisation or business, with the aim of controlling and saving costs, improving processes and services, and to add value. So as we sort of go through that, that's the sort of definition I'll be using. As you can see, as a business, we specialise working pretty much exclusively with the public and not-for-profit sector, so hopefully lots of congruent experience to bring to the conversation today. And I won't really sort of say anything more about the YPO framework, as you've heard from Amy, other than say I think it's something we've worked with for a number of years, and from our experience, it works very well for all parties involved. So Amy, that's my brief introduction done.
So we'll move on then. So Richard, I'm hearing a lot from our contracting authorities about struggles within the recruitment market. So that's both in relation to temporary and permanent recruitment and the pressures this is placing on organisations as a whole. So if you're able to just talk through current market trends, I know we've got this graph and some data that you've provided, so I'll hand over to you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm probably 2 or 3 minutes here really. I think, look, the big headline that we're all facing up to now and that we all have to work within is there's been a fundamental change in worker availability. And I think the quote from Arcadis on the left-hand side there, I think sums it up fairly concisely, you know, that we're now in a permanently tighter labour market. So no great sort of, you know, surprise here. This has been top of the news agenda for some time, but I think there is a general consensus that we've now entered into a new era. So what I've tried to do is to pick a graph and a bit of data to illustrate the change, and that's what you can see here. And so let me just explain what you're looking at. So this is a graph from the monthly KPMG REC UK report on jobs. And this report has been produced monthly since 1997. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the REC is the Recruitment and Employment Confederation, who represent UK recruitment agencies. So this specific graph is taken from that report, and it's the monthly tracking of worker availability by recruitment agencies who contribute data to the survey, and it measures the availability both permanent and temporary workers. So the green line, it represents the permanent workers, and the temporary line, and the blue line rather, represents temporary workers. So basically anything below the 50 line, that line that goes across the middle, is a shortage. And as you can see, there's been two main spikes upward, for this period that goes back to 2007. And that was the global financial crash, which you can sort of see around about in 2009, 2010. And then, of course, more recently, COVID, around 2020, where there was less demand. But hopefully, as you can see from the red tracking line, there has been a material change in the last year or so, if you sort of look at this picture taken as a whole back to 2007. So to put some data on this, over the period between September 2020 and September 21, the Office of National Statistics reported a drop of around about 500,000 workers in the UK workforce. So that was for that 12-month period. And I think, if you obviously measure outside that, there's more. But for that 12-month period, that was about a 1.5% drop in the UK workforce. A lot of this is Brexit, of course, and I think that's been well documented, but there's also been some impact from increasing levels of early retirements, in and around the COVID piece. However, regardless of that, we are where we are. And I think to context this around the housing association sector, certainly from my experience of working with the sector over the years, most of the roles, and probably specialist housing roles aside, there is competition for skills elsewhere, so that could be from other non-housing organisations, from the wider public and not-for-profit sector, but also from the sort of private sector too. So, there is an unprecedented situation, and I think, certainly what I'm seeing is for most organisations, and Amy, I guess this goes back to the point that you started this slide with, is that, recruitment and retention is becoming much more of a challenge or a pain point. And I think, from that, there is an increased sort of focus and an increased sort of review on this as an area. And I think, this is the call to action behind today's webinar. So I'll sort of pause there. Does that help sort of frame, the big picture about, why it's worth shining the spotlight on today?
Certainly does. And I think it really nicely demonstrates the relationship between temporary and permanent recruitment as well. And the way they interlink and react with one another, I think, is becoming more relevant for our contracting authorities. And the fallout from this is that the shortage of permanent workers, as outlined in that graph, is only going to increase the reliance on temporary labour. And I think, Richard, that moves us nicely onto our next point is, what factors do you typically consider to be an influence on temporary worker reliance, and how those have perhaps changed in recent years? So I'll move us on.
Right. Well, I think, look, and you sort of posed this question. So I think the answer to the question is, will temporary workers become more essential in the delivery of services, in this year and beyond? I think the answer is likely to be yes. As ever, no one has a crystal ball, but I think based on what we know at the moment, the answer is likely to be yes. And I think, let's just try and understand why that would be. So I think what I've tried to do here is just to step back a bit, just to frame what temp worker use looks like in the sector right now. And I've tried to do that on the right-hand side of the screen here. And my sense is that temp worker use is across most parts of the organisation when you look at the housing association sector. Now, obviously, within this, there'll be some areas that there'll be significantly higher use. Some areas might be occasional use. But, I think the starting point is it's likely to be in most places and most departments and functions, within the organisation. Now, how much any housing association or housing provider uses is going to vary from organisation to organisation. From my experience, there is no formula. It's very specific to each organisation, and it's going to be driven by a bunch of different factors. However, in general terms, it's a fairly significant area of spend, and it's an area which tends to use up quite a lot of time and resources in terms of the management and the facilitation of temporary workers as well. So it is an important area from that side. Now, if I jump to the left-hand side, from the data that we see as an organisation, there's 5 primary reasons that we see across our customers in the public and not-for-profit sector to why temporary workers are used. Actually, there's quite a few more than this, but for the sake of today, we've got half an hour, so let's just pick out the main 5. And if you look at the context of the sort of changing world, I think there's two that you've got to sort of look at here that lead me to believe there's going to be an increase in sort of temporary work use. So the first one I think is sickness cover. Now, COVID hasn't gone away, and there's two people on this call, myself and Amy, who have both had COVID in the last 2 weeks. So there's definitely likely to be high levels of sickness cover, within the sort of short to medium term. There is a spring peak now, and I think most experts are saying there's going to be another peak later on in the winter. So that is a real factor. Again, beyond this year, who knows? But COVID seems to be here for the time being. And secondly, and I think this is by far and away the most important one, the number of unfilled perm posts is likely to grow, and those are now taking longer to be filled. And this is direct feedback I've been getting over the last sort of 2 or 3 months, particularly from sort of resourcing teams within housing associations and housing providers. And I think within this, it's also really important just to sort of look at those areas of the workforce where it's always been difficult to attract sort of perm staff, and there has been a reliance on temporary workers over the years. And I think the challenge there is going to remain acute, and I think particularly areas like care and support will be an example of that, or perhaps tradespeople within the sort of property maintenance piece. So, I think for me, to conclude this slide, Amy, I think likely an increasing need for most organisations, and certainly not a reduction on what we can see at the moment.
Absolutely, and thank you, Richard. And I think it's clear from what we've spoken about that the temporary recruitment world is changing, and it's gone through quite a rapid change in the last year. Obviously, it's been necessary for managed service providers to adapt to these circumstances. So I think if we look at our next slide, and you can talk us through how they've met that challenge, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, no problem at all. So I think I'll just wait for it to click through. Yeah, lovely. Okay, so look, I think again, just to sort of step back a little bit. If we take the data that I showed you on that graph earlier, and I think you couple that with the Office of National Statistic data I referenced, then I think for me there's a compelling picture of change in market conditions as we move into this new era of a permanently tighter sort of labour market. And I've also said, I think for most organisations, as I've just talked about on the prior slide, that's probably going to be an increase. And, my sense is that's going to mean a reprioritisation or a refocus of recruitment and retention strategies, as a key issue for 2022 and beyond. And obviously within that, it's a much bigger picture than just temporary. Obviously, we've got a spotlight on temporary today, but, permanent is obviously a key factor as well. So I think, in some respects, the why behind why would you consider the MSP model to an extent is actually outside of the changing market conditions. But that said, I do think that the MSP model is probably the best way to cope with the changes if they are having an impact on your organisation. So what I'm trying to do with this slide, or what I wanted to do with this slide, is just, as Amy had introduced, is just update what the MSP model is looking like in 2022, so you have an informed picture if you are considering your options. And I think for me, the start point is to recognise that the managed service model has been evolving, and it's evolved really over the last sort of 20 years or so. And if you go back to the sort of first iteration, which I guess is that on the left-hand side, that sort of slide in the 2000s, it was really focused on, for the first time, providing real visibility of temporary workers. And this was really by capturing everything into one place by using technology, and then building supply chains to support requirements, and then starting to manage those supply chains on behalf of the customer. And I think if you look at the goals back then, not terribly dissimilar to what they are today. The drive was to improve fulfillment, but also critically to drive cost savings via a compliant procurement solution. And this was particularly in the local authority sector, and that's where it started very much within the public and not-for-profit arena. The second iteration, and this is grossly simplistic, but during the sort of 2010s, it builds on that and it adds to that, and it starts to sort of look at putting in effective controls around compliance. But what we're also starting to see as well is dedicated service provision to go with the technology. So, the provision of dedicated account management or on-site to help work with customers, and also the use of management information to really understand better sort of what's going on, to sort of help with temporary workforce management and planning. And the last iteration, which kind of brings things up to date, it sort of builds on the first two, and it kind of now adds in 4 new areas. Now, these are broad themes, but you should expect these things, or look for these things within your managed service provision today. So the first one is a phrase which is becoming increasingly fashionable around sort of total contingency workforce management. And this is really starting to integrate all aspects of the temporary or contingent workforce into the solution to maximise efficiency. So what you do is you build the talent pool or bank staff into the solution, statement of works, those types of things. And I think the talent pool in particular is a really important strategic tool, which is going to be becoming more and more at the heart of MSP solutions, of finding skills, but also offsetting sort of temporary agency worker spend. Real-time management information, and this is really just I suppose part one of optimizing technology. So as an example, we as a business look at pay rates every week across all the categories we supply across 100 odd UK customers, to ensure that every customer has got benchmarked rates to the correct levels to attract workers, but also that they're not overpaying in the market. So it's a really good example of real-time management information, whereas historically it probably would have been looking at retrospective data, if that makes sense. The second part of optimizing technology is looking at areas like digital compliance. That's a really potentially exciting area, but also starting to integrate the sort of managed service solution into sort of HR, finance, applicant tracking systems. So what you start to get this sort of situation where your temporary workers can be seen alongside the perm workers, and this is absolutely critical from sort of workforce planning, but particularly linking how you build those temp workers into sort of perm recruitment requirements. And then last but not least, there was a fairly significant change in legislation around social value last year. And now, it's a really key strategic consideration of being able to provide specific and measurable action against the key themes that you will be reporting on as organisations. And managed service providers, particularly when working a partnership perspective, are uniquely placed, particularly around helping on areas of employability and skills development and those types of things. And as I conclude this slide, I think probably 2 caveats. I think caveat 1 is managed service models aren't universal, and not all providers will do all of the above. And I think by showing you this slide, I think what my intention is almost to kind of go, look, these are the elements you should be looking for. Are those elements there? And I think the second thing is it's a given that the managed service provider has to perform, and some providers could be a bad fit if their model isn't right for you or their expertise isn't right. And I guess that's what the tender competition is there for, and that's where someone like YPO comes in. But I do think if set up correctly, there are huge benefits to be had with this model, and I do think it is the best model to meet the challenges that we're now seeing within the market as it now is, Amy. So that's that slide. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a little bit more complicated than the slides, but hopefully that makes sense, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think you raised some really nice points as well, and I think the comment around real-time MI and benchmarking and pay rates should hopefully be reassuring for everybody we've got on the call today. Obviously, we've seen a lot around pay rates, both in temp and perm, sort of running away, and it is, as you said, Richard, it's that partnership and working together to make sure that the solution works properly. I think as well, a lot of what you've said, particularly in that final point around social value and sustainability, it does show just how these solutions are in line with the current procurement situation as well. So obviously we're aware that the new regulations are coming in, and it'll be interesting to see quite what focus they bring around social value and sustainability and beyond what's been outlined in the papers so far. But again, just that key point on partnership and what can be achieved through these solutions, I think is a key takeaway. So I think then if we look to our next slide, Richard, can you give us, I suppose, the key points that you think organisations should be considering when looking for whether a managed service provision is the right solution for their temporary or permanent requirements, whether that be, their first or their 5th iteration? I think a provider perspective on this will be really helpful.
No, that's fine. Yeah, so I think look, we've got 30 minutes, and we deliberately, when we were talking about preparing this, we deliberately wanted to keep it quite a short session, because everyone is obviously, we're all very busy people nowadays. But It's been very high level, and it's limited in terms of the detail we've been able to get into, but hopefully it's about giving you food for thought. And the last thing we wanted to give you was a bit of a takeaway, so it is simplistic, but something you can take in terms back of your thinking, take back to your management tables or conversations with your colleagues. So what we're trying to do here is we've tried to pose, just 5 things to think about, 5 key questions. I think we framed it as a very simple sort of diagnostic tool to help you decide what model is the best, given the challenges that you now face. And on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see here, look, there are effectively 3 models. You can either run a preferred supply list, which is effectively where you manage it yourself, or if you look at the managed service option, there is a master vendor version and a neutral vendor version. And to a certain extent, the only issue that matters is getting the right fit for you and the right model for you. So the sort of questions that we would ask you to think about, propose to think about is firstly, looking at doing some discovery. What does it look like for you in terms of volume, frequency? What's the reasons behind your temporary worker use? And the volume point is important, because if temporary agency work use is a really small item for you and the volume isn't there, then PSL probably is the better option. But what I certainly find is that without that just fundamental discovery and capture and starting to understand some of those patterns, it's actually quite a difficult conversation to have. And I think, when you start to get to that sort of, actually our key issues about care and support, then you immediately start getting to, right, well, we need a supplier who's got a track record in care and support, for example. Secondly, it's starting to understand what's not working for you and the issues and challenges you need to address. And, I think this is framed about this new world we're in. So the typical things, that I see, challenges around fulfillment levels, challenges around uncontrolled rate rises, new suppliers that may be being brought on and aren't complying with procurement rules, concerns about worker compliance, visibility on spend, and what I think is really important is as you start to understand those challenges, is then starting to think, right, okay, well, what evidence could a potential supplier provide, and if I frame this around MSP, what are they doing elsewhere, and how do I know they're going to be able to meet my challenges? Key objectives, I sort of see this as a bit of a broader point, but most people I speak to say one of their key objectives is actually to use less temporary agency workers, not more. And it's a really interesting sort of dynamic of understanding what those are and then how they feed in and how they're going to be delivered, because they will be different to sort of issues and challenges, but nevertheless will be as important. In terms of service provision, this is about enabling you to meet your goals, and it always sort of falls into that, what service do the hiring managers require? Is it predominantly a technology-led solution, or do you need a technology plus people solution? How are the needs of your hiring community going to be met? And it might also be, within the service provision, there are suppliers that are really important to you that you want to retain, and how, if you do the MSP model, is that going to happen? There'll be certain levels of management information you want, etc. So it's starting to think about those things as well. And then last but not least, what are the additional goals and strategies to address? So I think this is things like talent pools, social value, some of the things I've talked about, but it may well be as well building in local suppliers, local SME suppliers, if you are looking at the MSP model. So it's very simplistic, but it's the core things that once you sort of get to grips with that agenda, puts you in a great place then to be able to understand, and hopefully, Amy, I'll now pass this back to you, work with someone like YPO on shaping what is then the best model.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've covered it off perfectly, Richard. I think the thing I would add to that is, once you've answered those questions and thought, okay, a managed service provider is the route that we need for our temporary recruitment or permanent recruitment, that then you come forward and say, let's start thinking about engaging with the market and to have these conversations. I hope that what the previous slides have shown is that this is a changing market, and it's innovative and it does adapt. So if you're in your first iteration and you've never used a managed service provider before, that it's very important to have those conversations to get that broad understanding. But equally, if you're in your 4th or 5th generation, it's still worth going out and speaking to providers to understand what's changed, I suppose. And yeah, as Richard said, you know, YPO are on hand to support organisations through that process, so through soft market engagement and beyond, so specification writing and looking at your further competition as a whole. So I think, unless you've got anything to add, Richard, we'll move on to see if there's any questions.
No, I'm absolutely fine with that, thank you.
Perfect. I've also just noticed that my email address is wrong there. It's .co.uk for me, so minus points for not properly checking that final slide. So some questions that we have got. First one is, what would be a fair KPI for fulfillment percentage? I think really that is something that's going to depend upon your specific requirements and might be a better conversation to be had offline. But Richard, before we move on from that, I don't know if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, I think there's two aspects to this. So I think the fulfillment rates depend very much on the model to begin with, and the whole point of, you know, a managed service model is that allows you to influence fulfillment rates because you have someone doing the work for you. And I would expect fulfillment rates within the sort of model that we operate to be north of 90% for all categories within the agreed sort of SLA terms that we provide. And we have live, again, going back to the point of live MI, we have live MI around our fulfillment rates, so we can literally judge that on a daily, weekly basis. But you know, I would also then go back to the point I made, is you should ask for evidence of fulfillment rates if you're considering this model. And there are some categories that are really, you know, as we all know, harder to find people in than others. So, you know, it's being realistic, but equally it's making sure that there are clear plans to drive those. And I think the other thing I would say as well is that, you know, sometimes that there is a build up to hit those fulfillment rates, and, you know, particularly if you're starting from a position where, you know, you're perhaps not in the best shape, if you know, if the fulfillment rates are currently low, you know, it may take a few weeks to build up to those. But yes, you should have an expectation that there should be, you know, a very high level if you use the managed service model, and I do ask for data.
Thank you. So the next question we've got is about the framework. So suppliers on the YPO framework seem like quite sizable organisations. Were smaller agencies approached to join the framework, and do we have any insight as to why they may not have tendered? So the framework was established using the open procedure under the Public Contract Regulations 2015. So every organisation had the opportunity to bid for it, and significant market engagement will have been done by my colleagues. The establishment of this framework does predate me at YPO. I think the framework itself is established as a national solution and required evidence of ability to deliver. I think as well, with some smaller agencies, it might be more suitable to sit within supply chains. And certainly we've got a very high fulfillment through the MSP models of SMEs. So I think that covers off that point. It's more likely that happy to sit elsewhere.
All I would just add to that is, I think the engagement of SMEs is hugely important. And again, I would have that down as being one of the absolute sort of key, you know, going back to those key questions, you know, if you are going to use a managed service model, how does that managed service model engage with SMEs, and please provide evidence of that, because I think that's a hugely important agenda, and I think that links directly into social value in particular.
Yeah, and those are the points that we covered off as well, weren't we, about how these solutions in particular are a great example of what can be achieved from social value sustainability perspective. So the next question we've got is, are more organisations wanting temp to perm, and is it worth requesting temp to perm when requesting staff? So Richard, I do think you're going to be best placed to answer this from an operational point of view, but the only point I would add is that temp to perm is covered off in the YPO framework specification. So Richard, I'll hand to you.
I just think it's a given, to be honest with you, that temp to perm should be in there. And look, there is a balance here. I think the balance is there is a fairness to the agencies. And, you know, one of the things that we're absolutely clear on, you know, when we look at the agencies we work with, is fairness, because you know, those agencies are our supply partners. You know, however, within that, I think there comes a point where there is a legitimate, you know, a legitimate argument that the temporary worker has been there for a while. The costs and profit that the agency has recovered, and if that worker has an opportunity to go into a perm role, they should be encouraged. And that should not be done at a cost after a qualification period. And I think increasingly, and I guess this is my point about total contingency workforce management, you have to look at the temporary worker pool as being a key feed into permanent requirements. And again, I just think that if that's something that's not being done, that's the missed opportunity.
Thank you. So next question we've got then is, given it's very much a supplier's market, what would you say are good considerations for buying organisations to make themselves attractive to their potential supply chain? And I think the first point that I would have on this is that a lot of that is to do with good supply chain management from your MSP, and as well engagement from within your organisation to the managed service provision that you've got in place. If you've got hiring managers who are looking elsewhere, obviously that will be attractive to the organisations who should be within the supply chain itself. I think there's a bigger point there as well around sort of employer value proposition and how that actually feeds into this as a bigger picture, and some of the topics we've touched on already. But Richard, do you want to jump in?
Well, I think I'll just probably reiterate some of the points that I've already made, but I think the fairness point is critical here, and I do accept that this is now more of a supplier market. Now, the fairness therefore within that is that people as suppliers have a fair crack at the whip to work with an organisation. And I think, if you go to the first principles of the challenges you have to resolve as an organisation, then if that leads you to the managed service route, then you then have to say, okay, well, look, we have to make sure that the supply chain that our managed service provider delivers is sustainable. And again, I just keep coming back to the point is show the evidence, and I think, certainly from my experience, you have to work very, very closely with the suppliers. It is a equal relationship. It's not, the job we do is very different. Speaking as a Matrix business, we're not a recruitment agency, so those supply relations are critical for us. But I think just keeps coming back to the point is ask your potential MSP supplier to evidence, how they would work with their suppliers to ensure that they're committed and it's sustainable supply chain in today's world.
Thank you. So we've got another one come through as well. So RSLs are facing some very specific staffing challenges, such as an ageing workforce within surveying or a dearth of candidates in trades and labour due to external factors such as Brexit. What role can the MSP play in solving these critical issues? And I think, Richard, I'm going to hand this one to you first off, just in case you've got any practical evidence, I suppose, that you can draw upon.
Yeah, I think this goes back to then, so I'm going to frame this just as the, why is the MSP model the best model? I think if you look at those areas where there is skill shortages, there's 2 or 3 things that you have to do. The first thing you have to do is you have to widen the supply chain. The second thing you have to do is look for diversity in the supply chain. And by doing those 2 things, you have the very, very best opportunity to reach, the full availability of sort of talent. I think then the third thing you then have to do is you then have to sort of look at the data, and you have to look at, what the requirements are. And this is then hopefully where your managed service, provider can add some value, because I certainly know when we sort of look at care and support, we have a colleague within our business who just 100% works as our supply chain manager, working with our care and support suppliers. But then we work incredibly hard with our individual customers to actually look at what that looks like, and just the best ways of either feeding people into sort of longer term perm roles, if that's part of the agenda, or just looking at the hiring patterns. So, if, for an example, there is a requirement for people at the weekend, we're not leaving that to the Friday evening to pick up that requirement. We know from the data that that's going to happen, and we can anticipate that and then work towards delivery against that. So then that becomes very much part of the sort of management role and working in partnership. There is no magic wand, so equally, let's make that clear, right? But there is an awful lot that can be done, optimizing technology, working with suppliers, working very hard, with a customer from a customer management perspective.
I think as well, it's that partnership that we touched on throughout the slides is, you're there as a specialist in the market. You've got, as you touched on, the data, and you've got the knowledge of recruitment itself. So you can feed into this. And again, when it comes to planning for the next iteration or the first iteration of your managed service solution, I think it's about asking the questions and making sure that you're aware of how your recruitment strategies for temp and perm do want to interact with each other, and knowing that the categories such as the ones you've identified in that question and where your struggles are. So the next question we've got, which Richard, I think this is going to come straight to you again, is with ever declining agency margins, how do MSPs keep specialist agencies engaged and willing to supply?
Well, I think they can't decline forever, and I think we probably have already reached the point that, and I would probably say 2 or 3 years ago, we reached the point that the agency margins are fair and sustainable, and I would absolutely counsel against against taking the agency margins to the point where no one wants to supply, because it's just a defeating position. What I would say though is that, and I've spent sort of, give or take 30 years working in and around sort of recruitment, much of that time working for a recruitment business. Most recruitment businesses now are very deliberately geared up to deliver to managed service contracts, because they are predominant across large organisations, whether public, private or not for profit. So that gives the agency an advantage, because it saves them quite a lot of costs in terms of, the jobs come to the agency, so they save an awful lot on marketing and sales costs. But again, it has to be sustainable, and I think that's where the expertise comes in for a good managed service provider. And I think when you look at a balanced scorecard, there absolutely has to be a focus on cost within that. But again, I would just challenge that, how would you deliver those costs? What's the evidence that they are sustainable cost savings? And as often as not, the sustainable cost savings, will come from things like tenure management, making sure you're not paying temp to perm fees, making sure the pay rates are right. It's those types of things, making sure your process costs are minimised, because you've got a consolidated invoice and management time is being saved. So it's a much broader picture, of which I think the agency margin is part of it, albeit a really important part.
I think as well, to add to that is, supply chain management is so important, but as you've touched on already, Richard, providers don't have a magic wand, and a part of this is contract management from the contracting authority side, and preventing hiring managers from going outside, perhaps to agencies that they've known before, who can fill these specialist roles, and they just want to go directly to them. I think some of it is an attitude change, and as Richard said, they can't say no forever. If they're not getting that opportunity from this off-contract spend that you don't want as an organisation, then they will need to fulfil through the dedicated route.
Yeah, and I just think there is an element of common sense here. The element of common sense is if your MSP provider is an expert in their local market, they will know what the local market is, and they will know that their agency margins and pay rates are sustainable and fair. Absolutely.
So I don't think we've got any other questions come through. Must have worn everybody out with the ones that we've done so far. So if there's nothing else, I think we'll end it there. As I said, we'll follow up to everyone who's attended with a recording of the session, and we'll work through those questions and provide a written response as well. And obviously you've got mine and Richard's contact details should you have any questions and want an offline chat.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and take care.